Thank you very much to the organizers and to AIA. I last presented on something like this back in 2009, some of the new work and tools that we've been doing. And I'm going to build a little bit on Len Liskew's presentation about some of the work in the Edmonton area, the capital region itself, and hopefully overview why it's important to sustain cities and why it's an agricultural issue. Brief outline. I'm going to give you a little history. We've got a lot of new or agrologists in training, I guess, or new professional agrologists to the conference. Give a real brief history of agriculture on the prairies, in particular in Alberta. Ask the question, why plan for agriculture? What's happening with our land use planning process here in Alberta and Canada? Tools for local governments. How do they plan for conservation and the environment? And what options are there for protecting agricultural land, farmland, and open space? The whole idea of promoting agricultural economic development and integrating agriculture and food systems into formal land use planning. I want to start though with some definitions, because these words have been floating around this morning. There were several definitions of sustainability and such, and I like the old Brundtland definition of sustainable development. I hate the word sustainability. Sustained growth, sustain this, sustain that. As we heard this morning, we have some issues with our global populations and with some of these growth trends. And how do we deal with it? The important thing is to consider future development that won't or will not impact future generations. And the First Nations people of Canada talked about the 7 generations principle. That's a long time. When we talk about development from a land use perspective, there has to be a long-term, some foresight and thought given to it, not just short-term, at the end of your nose kind of development. So defining land use. Land use is the classification of human activities impacting a landscape. It's the patterns of how we use land and water resources. It's the social use, the social, bringing in the social, the economic, obviously, and the environmental. According to the Canadian Institute of Planners, which I actually do a lot more work in my line of work with professional planners than I do with professional agrologists, if you can believe it. But according to the Canadian Institute of Planners, land use planning is the scientific, aesthetic, and orderly disposition of land, resources, facilities, and services with a view to securing the physical, the economic, and social efficiency, health, and well-being of urban and rural communities. Planners integrate the goals of sustainable development, good government, and economic viability. The big issue planners have to deal with is local politics. We'll touch on that one a little bit later. Also define ecology. We're a whole room full of professional agrologists. It's the science of agriculture and associated natural resources. In my work, I try to bring to land use planning the ideas of the science behind the sustainability of our food systems and the protection and stewardship of our natural resources. Am I a planner? No, I'm a professional agrologist. I'm also walking a fine line because I'm a federal government employee. The provincial, or the mandate for land use in Canada is provincial. So we fully respect the provincial role and the delegated authority to local governments of land use planning. And I'll explain that one a little bit later too. So a brief history of prairie agriculture. Of course, there was ranching and CPR and settlement on the prairies in Alberta. In the early teens, we had World War I, Turner Valley, 1914, Hell's Half Acre, the discovery of the largest supplies of conventional natural gas in Western Canada. The 30s, we had the recession and the drought. Why I'm giving this history, a lot of the land use planning decisions, the issues that we're facing today are based on decisions that were made almost a generation ago, 10 to 25 or 30 or 40 years ago. So the importance of decisions today is setting that stage or that course of development into the future. In the 1940s to 50s, of course, World War II, soldiers came home, there was mechanization of agriculture. Pardon me, I forgot there. Leduc number 1 was hit in 1947, February 1947, after 133 dry holes. Thank goodness they kept going. They knew the oil was there somewhere. Changed the face of Alberta forever. In the 1960s and 70s, again, we had drought. 1961 was one of the driest years on record. Was the introduction of the exotic beef breeds, cattle breeds at the time. 1974, wheat was king. We had booming prices. We also had, at that time, explosion in acreage and subdivision activity for kind of the first time in Alberta, because, as my dad likes to say, every idiot that thought he could farm came back to farm because prices were good. We also had something that the young folks might not know about is NEP, National Energy Program. For those of us that are old enough to remember that, that changed also I guess the dynamics between Alberta and central Canada quite substantially. And we had T-shirts at the time. I remember as a kid, let those eastern bastards freeze in the dark, and all those things. So, and again, like I say, acreage development, subdivisions, a lot of people were interested. Times were good. There was a boom on. They wanted to go back to the land. Then the 1980s hit. 1982, I remember 24% interest on my mortgage. Farm foreclosures, devastating time economically. But it drove the change for conservation tillage, direct seeding, on-farm diversification and development. But we had another drought. The late 1980s, we had another dry period. In the 1990s, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, introduction or understanding of GMOs came at that time. Mid-90s, we also had loss of the crow, actually the loss of the WGTP program. Beneficial management practices were talked about kind of the first time again. This is the time of the Brundtland, the Rio, UN Rio Commission, and conservation and sustainable development was first and foremost in starting to come into the common ways. Conversion of forages to livestock, again because of the loss of the crow, freight rates were impacted, so we saw a lot of grain lands going to forages, thus an increase in the livestock. More effort on globalization. Again, there was acreage development, another wave of acreages in the late, and because of that increase in livestock, because of the loss of the crow, we started to see all the ILO issues, which by 2002 became CFOs, confined feeding operations. So in the early 2000s, again, we had a record drought. We had actually two back-to-back droughts in the 2000s, 2002, 2009. BSC, of course, unfortunately in 2004. Avian flu, food versus fuel. This morning they talked a little bit about that whole issue of food stocks being used for fuel. The issue of agflation, a brand new term for the Webster's Dictionary in 2008 because of the rise in food prices globally. Cool issues with, again, livestock trade, country of origin labeling from the States. Huge impact on our livestock sector. And just last year, of course, CWB, huge changes. Since 2008, we've seen, though, significant increases in commodity prices. Prices have been at historic levels, unprecedented levels. You're talking $15, $16 canola, whereas before it was, you were lucky if you saw maybe $6, sometimes $7 a bushel. And just like in 2008, there's some analysts predicting 2013 is going to be the year of another food crisis because of these prices, these combinations, volatile markets. And here's just a nice little chart that talks about those spikes. The 1970s, I talk about wheat being king, price spikes, the mid-90s spike, the 2006 to 2008 spike, and of course there was an economic collapse, but we're back up again. So what is that doing? Why am I talking about this? Because it's land use. Well, land use follows economics. And Alberta's had a very, very rich history of land use type activities and involvement over the years. It started in the 1960s with Canada Land Inventory. That to this day still forms the basis of most of our land assessment valuation. The criteria that goes into land assessment. Is it class 1, is it class 2, class 3? Through the 70s, we started looking at agricultural land-based monitoring studies. Remember all those acreages? There was a lot of subdivisions. What's happening with our land? We're losing this land. It's been a long discussion. More of that work in the 1980s. Then regional planning commissions were established. They unfortunately were abolished though in 1995 with the new MGA, the Municipal Government Act. The Municipal Government Act to this day governs formal land use planning at the local government level in Alberta. Provincial land use policies were developed in '96, and in the 2000s it's been busy. There's been, I'm not going to go through that whole list, but Municipal Government Act review back in 2002 and again this year because of some of these pressures. We have Water for Life and the WPAC work. We've got ELSA, Land Use Framework there, Regional Growth Management, Premier directed growth management plans had to be in place for the Alberta Capital Region, that's Edmonton and the 25 surrounding municipalities, and the Calgary Regional Partnership, which didn't go that well with the rurals, but there still is a Calgary Regional Partnership. We're waiting right now, I guess LARP has been approved, the Land Use Framework Regional Plans. South Sask Plan is coming, but it's got a long history. It started, where is it, back in, the South Sask Regional Plan used to be SARS, and then because of the SARS, the avian flu, they had to change the name, right? And that became SAS, and now it's SSRP, and sorry for all the acronyms. But the provincial land use jurisdictions in Alberta are complex. There's a lot of different legislations and acts that follow into land use. With ESRD, of course, they've got the Water for Life policy, provincial policy, the cumulative effects management system under ELSA, land use framework, of course, IRM, integrated resource management in the green zone, parks and recreation, parks protected areas. What else? This is coming in June, a new Alberta energy regulator. The ERCB will be no more, and that's going to change a lot of the land use decisions based on energy and transmission lines and all that. And NRCB, I'm not sure if that's what's happening with the changes there. But essentially, back down to the Municipal Government Act, it delegates responsibility for residual land uses to local governments. All these things prior, local governments have to abide with provincial direction, but the rest is through local governments. So what is this land use planning process? There's formal and there's informal. Formal is legislated, informal is voluntary. So an example of formal land use planning is our municipal or regional plans. It's legislated. There's an act in behind that planning process. IRM, as I mentioned, on public lands in the green zone, it's a recognized formal land use planning process. Conservation planning, though, is informal. It's usually community-based. It is what our watershed planning is now in Alberta under the Water for Life. There is a note here, though. Formal watershed planning does exist in 2 other provinces in Canada. In Ontario, you've heard of conservation authorities, and in Manitoba, they have conservation districts. So formal watershed planning is actually under review right now as far as is it going to fit in the future as a formal land use planner in Alberta. So again, the province has the mandate. It's under the legislative authority of the MGA, the Municipal Government Plan. And local government's delegated authority for land use is in the form of statutory plans and non-statutory plans. Statutory plans include the Municipal Development Plan. That's the overall plan that guides development in each and every municipality in Alberta for the course of about 10 to 15 years. Intermunicipal development plans are usually between urbans and rurals or adjacent rurals to rurals. Okay? Area structure plans are usually site-specific. However, as I mentioned, there's a kind of a movement or investigation right now on whether or not some of the watershed planning in Alberta can be made into area structure plans, so that's exciting. Land use bylaws regulate the use and development of parcels. So that's the nitty-gritty, that's the how, the what, the specifics. And you've heard of land use zoning maps. That's according to the land use bylaw. So why plan for agriculture? Well, agriculture is one of many land use sectors in Canada. There's 6 land use sectors: energy and extraction or mining, agriculture, tourism, recreation, forestry, transportation, human settlement, sometimes called urban, developed, built up, whatever. Canada is largely a resource sector-based economy and depends on our land for economic well-being. We see that a lot in Alberta. However, the land development paradigm has traditionally maligned agriculture and food systems. With development pressures, often agriculture and food systems are poorly represented in the development process. Land is seen as a commodity, and this whole concept of higher and better use, usually a short-term vision rather than a long-term for sustainable development purposes, because a lot of the, again, the development community is looking at getting in, developing that, and moving on. Rural municipalities face annexation pressures to supply long-term needs of urban jurisdictions. We're seeing that right now again in Edmonton, and wanting to take big chunks of Leduc south of the airport. Natural capital is usually negatively valued, and the real kicker here is 2/3 of land with any farming capability are within 80 kilometers of the 23 census metropolitan areas. What's a census metropolitan area? Well, that's the Edmonton census metropolitan area, and that's the Calgary metropolitan area. So not quite the CRP, not quite the CRB, but that's, again, people settled where the land and water resources were good. I'm given questions almost every day from planners. And some of these, again, you have to try to answer. Some of them you get frustrated with because is agriculture still valued in our province? Does it continue to be an important form of economic and cultural perspective? How is it being impacted by increasing land values? Should you and how could you protect agricultural land from development? What is the link between agriculture and ecosystem goods and services? Is food security part of the equation? And is agriculture changing? Is it becoming more diversified? Some are really good questions, some are very frustrating. And we talked this morning about social license and the lack of awareness about most of our population now is 2 or more generations removed from the land. So what is the value of our industry? Agriculture and food systems contribute 8.1% of Canada's GDP. What does that mean? Well, they're the 3rd largest contributor to GDP after the finance sector and all other manufacturing. From the employment standpoint, 1 in 8 jobs is related directly or indirectly to agriculture, and the food service sector is the largest. That's a no-brainer. In Alberta, up until probably about 2004, 2005, food and beverage manufacturing in Alberta was #1, surpassing oil and gas, chemical products, and refined petroleum. Of course, things escalated, would have been 2006, 2007 with the oil sands. So that has changed. So, but it is significant, second only to the oil products. And from a primary ag standpoint, what's farm cash receipts? Again, we see the split from beef to our crops to dairy hogs. So there are tools out there for local governments, tools that we can use either geospatially or through methodologies or whatever. And a really cool study that Mark Anelski, an economist, did for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities was actually looking at what is the Canadian municipal ecological footprint of these major urban centres. And you'll see this is Calgary and Edmonton. Out of all the major centres in Canada, Calgary and Edmonton have the largest footprint. I was involved with that agricultural inventory and assessment study that Len Liskew mentioned earlier today with last year's work with the City of Edmonton and the FRESH strategy, the citywide food and ag strategy. We were not allowed to use the term sprawl because they didn't think sprawl existed. So what can local governments do? On the urban ag perspective, there's tons of stuff, and you've seen this before, from community gardens and farmers markets to edible landscapes, agroforestry, gleaning, taking either, products that maybe aren't #1 on the grocer's shelf, but taking them and using them for consumption. The #1 thing is supporting and promoting local and regional food production. Agriculture happens regionally. It doesn't happen in just a city. It doesn't just happen in one municipality. Agriculture happens regionally based on landscape features. Protecting farmland and open space is paramount. Defining and allowing agriculture uses under more than one land use classification or zoning is critical because a lot of our really entrepreneurial agricultural producers are doing more than just agriculture. It's a mix of either mercantile or direct marketing of some sort. It might be packaging, it might be agritourism. You know, they aren't typical type operations. So this whole study of food systems is right from food production, processing, all the way down to understanding waste management and the ecological, social, economic, nutritional health of a particular geographic place. As Francis Gardner from Southern Alberta Land Trust Society so succinctly put it, it's intuitively bridging landscape to food. And again, you've seen these charts before. From producers to consumers, there's this whole primary, secondary, tertiary sectors in between. The whole agri-value component, agri-support services make up the food system. And why plan for it? Because it is cornerstone of sustainable development. And sustaining cities, I stole my title today from the founder of holistic management, Alan Savory. In 2002, he presented at an American Farmland Trust conference I was at in California. And at that time, all these folks from USDA were talking about the same thing we're talking about here today. And they said, well, if we lose all our land, where are we going to, where's that someplace else that we can get it from? And the whole room said, well, we'll go to Canada. And I was sitting there as probably the lone Canadian in the audience going, oh my goodness. So the scope of the food system is huge, from consumers to retailers, processors, producers, all the people involved, each and every year. It's over $44 billion a year. Our food system is huge. But a lot of times, our planners, our local decision makers don't see it because all they see are the primary ag statistics. And that's not where it's all at. In planning for conservation and the environment, last year ALTA, the Alberta Land Trust Alliance, did a survey of all the local governments in Alberta and asked the question, does your government have formal goals and strategies for land conservation? This was no. Some did. Some it was kind of in development, and 2% didn't know. So in planning for conservation and the environment, what are those obstacles then to setting land conservation goals? This says competing demands and priorities, aka politics, I guess. Lack of planning resources, that is a huge one. That is a very huge constraint. They say it's lack of community support in the rural areas. That's interesting. The big one I want to draw your attention to is the lack of access to required expertise or professional services. There is a huge role for professional agrologists to play in guiding and providing support and information and data to professional planners. So, and again, tons of tools in protecting farmland and open space. Fortunately, a lot of these tools and suggestions were provided for the Edmonton strategy, but it was a very challenging process. We actually surpassed, back in the late 90s, globally, population growth and decreased planted land, where the amount of land available versus population growth, we're past the tipping point. And among all the G8 nations, Canada, again, is growing the fastest. So we have real population growth pressures that we have to be aware of. This is an interesting map from the UN, world urbanization prospects. You've heard about the split of, it's 81% now urban, 19% rural as the split of our population. All of the dark blue on this map are facing those same kind of distributions. So majority of the percentage of urban population in these dark blue areas is over 75%. There was mention of the BC situation, the Agricultural Land Reserve. 1973, it was established to protect the valuable land resources because of the geology of BC. It's either mountains or it's valley bottoms, right? So they did have the foresight. It has not been without challenges, though, keeping land in the LR. Quebec also has Agricultural Land Reserve established in 1978. Those are the only two provinces that have ALRs. In trying to paint the economic picture of the cost of development, and this was referenced, I think, either by Len or this morning, cost of community services studies. For every dollar of tax revenue that municipalities get in, What is the cost of providing that service? Well, you can see on commercial and industrial, this is from the States, less than 30 cents, less than 40 cents, pardon me, this is commercial industrial, open space, working or agricultural lands, residential is over $1. Red Deer County did a similar study a few years ago, and they found the same thing. This is commercial, 74 cents on the dollar. Industrial was less than 10. Residential was almost 2. And agriculture or working ag lands was about 70 cents. Agricultural economic development. Agriculture is diverse and dynamic. It needs to change over time to adapt to market conditions. It's a fact. We've seen that. We've done egg profiling studies over the last probably 25 years, looking at different areas of Canada, and the actual production practices have changed dramatically based on market opportunities or market pressures. The whole agri-value piece, from an economic development standpoint, our municipalities and their economic development officers don't even have agriculture in most cases on their radar. There's so many opportunities here. And with the agri-support services, the biggest story I have on this is years ago in that annexation with Edmonton in 1982, they changed the zoning and there was a seed cleaning plant in the northeast. And because of the change in the zoning, that seed plant couldn't operate anymore. Well, they had no idea how many producers utilized that seed cleaning plant. And when that seed cleaning plant went out of business, it impacted a lot of producers. They had to go much further or greater costs to get their seed cleaned. Again, they have no, again, it's a communication thing.
The food system is further removed from the farm, from the land and water supplies to sustain it. Awareness is a huge issue. Sometimes agriculture, because of this lack of awareness, is often maligned in current media and nationwide newspapers. A couple of recent articles that I found are listed here. Their links are listed there, and one was the downside of investing in agriculture. While it emphasized the recent market surges in commodity prices, albeit the volatility and risks in dabbling in the commodity market, one of the biggest downsides it mentioned was the whole morality of investing in agriculture. It felt or highlighted issues pertaining to animal welfare and abuse or neglect, detrimental impacts on the environment and such. Totally forgoing any information or knowledge about current practices, current codes of practice, beneficial management practices, and real-world efforts, generational and for decades, on promoting and sustaining environmentally sustainable ag practices. The second one I've listed there is from demographia.com. Now, that's a information source that the development industry and some nationwide newspapers have quoted, and they actually attribute a smart growth as the cause of the economic collapse of 2008. And as most of us know it, that is the furthest thing from the truth. And this is a fail circulated to the email a while back that I still use to this day, and an example of, again, just lack of awareness. To all you hunters who kill animals for food, shame on you. You ought to go to the store and buy the meat that was made there where no animals were harmed. So awareness is a huge challenge, a lot of work, and a lot of effort is needed. So we'll just advance to the next slide. Integrating agriculture and food systems into municipal planning, looking at the issues local governments have before them, from transportation, energy, waste management, all the aspects of socioeconomic development to land use planning, growth management planning. Agriculture and food systems are inextricably linked to all of these. Whether or not you're producing, whether or not you're processing, transporting, storing food products, these aspects of municipal governance are all-encompassing for our food supply. I want to acknowledge this was work done by H.B. Lanark in the early days of the City of Edmonton food strategy work. All of these processes, integrating them at appropriate scale and context. And again, as I mentioned earlier, working on the 2012 fresh strategy, the City of Edmonton's local food, citywide food and ag strategy, it was a very, very challenging process trying to highlight the benefits, bring forward science-based information and data. And unfortunately, the political will at the time, essentially, a lot of that good information was left absent from the report. And it's been unfortunately publicly criticized. Len Mitzke in his previous presentation talked about the travesty of not addressing some issues such as irrigation, and that we did try to address it. It was deemed out of scope by the people behind the strategy. So food systems branding is something that we can bring forward a lot of information on the benefits of local and regional food systems. This is an example from Ontario. Foodland Ontario was an initiative that began in the late 70s. And promotion over the years, it's actually culminated in an actual local food act in Ontario here in 2013. So actually, from policy and practice into actually enabling legislation, a great job there. And I mentioned earlier, as far as local initiatives or provincial initiatives, existing initiatives, in Alberta, the Local Food Plus was considered. In Ontario, it's a very strong organization looking at not only the branding aspects of the marketing to the consumers, but the certification processes and identity kind of patterns similar to the organic certification, the certification for actual local food producers to enable and to complement that branding. So great work there. Over time, over history, and development is a natural result of growth. When provinces like Alberta have the growth pressures that we do, those turn quickly into development pressures and impacts on land and water resources. But the main question is, how do we grow? That is a choice. Business as usual, urban sprawl, that type of development is not going to cut it in future years. And how we grow, there's lots of world stage examples and case studies that show how best to do this and plan for the long-term sustainable development that's critical to accommodate growth while protecting quality of life. The tools and the methods are available. We've seen that. We know that. The main thing is political will. And our political leaders and the decision makers have to have the foresight. And hopefully they have the foresight. It's absolutely paramount. So thank you for your time. And if there's any questions, thanks.